Good morning, everyone. So I'd like to start out today. Sorry, I'm going to have to sort of lean forward because I've got the computer on one table and then my books on another table here. By talking a little bit about what the definition of a bodhisattva is. And sorry, before I do that, let's see if I can change the view here so I can see everyone. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so what is a bodhisattva? Originally, this word referred to Shakyamuni himself in previous lives. So before he became the Buddha, he was referred to as the Bodhisattva. So of course, this word, Bodhi means awakening, sattva is being. So he was the being kind of in the process of awakening over the course of his previous lives. It wasn't until the rise of Mahayana Buddhism that this term became applied more broadly. And the definition there came to be someone who's sort of intentionally delaying their own nirvanizing so that they can stay in the samsaric world to help other beings realize awakening. We can also think of it as, of course, someone who follows the Bodhisattva vows, so the vows that we'll say at the end of Dharma talks. And more generally, you can just think of it as someone who helps to bring about awakening in others, right? That's someone who expounds the Dharma for others. So the reason that I'm bringing this up, so the talk today is Bodhisattvas Coming Out of the Earth. And this is a chapter in the Lotus Sutra. But I was thinking about this chapter because of the cicadas emerging from the ground in the past couple of weeks here. And there's a rich tradition in East Asian Buddhism of an idea of the insentient preaching the Dharma. So cicadas are sort of sentient. They're not really like rocks or pebbles, of course. They have some capacity for sentience. But still, they're pretty sort of basic life form, I guess you could say. But I thought it'd be interesting to think about, how the cicadas, loud as they are, sort of preach the Dharma to us. And I think that there are a number of levels on which we can think about this happening. Of course, in Japan, generally, cicadas are used as a symbol for impermanence. So there's a Japanese proverb. It's something like, fireflies only last 5 days, cicadas only 3. And this is, one of these 4-character idioms for impermanence. So I thought I'd dig in a little bit to some of the tradition regarding the insentient preaching the Dharma. So there is a chapter of the Shobogenzo by this name, the insentient preach the Dharma or expound the Dharma, Mujo Seppo. And in that chapter, Dogen wrote, expounding the Dharma within Dharma expounding is the actualization of reality that has been entrusted from Buddha ancestors to Buddha ancestors. So this is basically saying that preaching the Dharma is kind of the same as true reality itself. So often we think of a particular instance of someone talking about the Buddha's teaching as being preaching the Dharma, but if what all of these teachings are getting at is the true reality of all beings, which is impermanence, which is life and reality simply as it is, then everything in this world, everything in this universe is always preaching the Dharma. There's no special sermon that needs to be given for us to receive an expounding of Dharma when it's happening all around us. So back in August of 2020, Hojo-san did a genzo-e on this chapter of Shobogenzo, Mujo Seppo. And he explained that this idea of the insentient expounding the Dharma arose actually in China, not in India. It has no Indian basis, really. I mean, I guess you could say it has a basis, of course. But it didn't really come about until Buddhism moved to China. And specifically, it arose in a school that's called Sanron, which means sort of like the three doctrines or three treatises, I guess, three treatise school. And this is considered sort of the Chinese version of what's called the Madhyamaka school in India. So that was Nagarjuna's school of the middle way, basically, sort of represented by the Heart Sutra that we chant each morning. So this idea that emptiness and the relative are perfectly interpenetrating, and both are true. So form is emptiness, emptiness is form. That's the basic idea of this school, right? This school, the Sanron school, was founded by the students of Kumara Jiva, who is actually the translator of the Lotus Sutra that I'm going to be talking about today. One of them, actually, it was translated several times, but his version is by far the most popular and sort of the standard version. And one of his students, a person named Seng Zhao, wrote that heaven, earth, and I have the same root. Myriad things and I are one body. And the idea here is that if we truly live in emptiness, if there's no separation, then there's no separation between sentient and insentient beings. So heaven, earth, and I have the same root. So this is sort of where this idea takes off and gets going. This idea that insentient beings are preaching the dharmas, because if there's no separation between us and them, then awakening is no less available to the insentient compared to us. There's a famous koan story, there are actually several, but one in particular that Dogen likes to talk about involves Nanyan Huizhong, who is also known as the national teacher. This is a monk that Dogen really respects and quotes frequently. And he told a monk basically, this idea that insentient beings are constantly expounding the Dharma. But he gives it this little twist where he says, only Buddhas can hear it. So a monk asks, are living beings able to hear it or not? That is the expounding of the Dharma by insentient beings. And he responds, when living beings hear it, they are not living beings. And the idea here is, and Dogen plays with this extensively in the fascicle, but that we essentially need to participate in this non-sentience in order to kind of go beyond discrimination and truly hear the Dharma. That's sort of what he's getting at, is this non-separation between sentience and insentience, and he's sort of using non-sentience as a synonym for the absolute. So back to Dogen in the fascicle here, he says, when the great way is completely perfected, expounding the Dharma is also completely perfected. So that is to say that awakening and expounding the Dharma are essentially the same thing, right? So, if the expounding the Dharma by insentient beings is expressing perfect true reality, that itself is awakening. So then if we take the two together, then, true reality is awakening, right? Or seeing true reality is awakening. In this sense, everything in reality, whether it's insentient or sentient, is constantly expounding the Dharma. And all of reality is a benevolent bodhisattva, one could say, which does not exclude the cicadas that have been calling loudly at us for the past several weeks. Okay, so, and another reason that I like this connection here is because in all of these old Indian Mahayana Sutra texts, they love really big numbers. They love talking about billions of millions of myriads of kotis of bodhisattvas, being in the Buddha's assembly or whatever. And of course, this is the case with the periodical cicadas. You read all these articles in the news trying to estimate the number of these things, and estimates do go up into the billions of individuals, and they talk about how many there are per square feet in some areas. And kind of interestingly, as I remember it, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area where the same brood 10, also comes out on the same cycle. And I seem to remember them just being sort of everywhere and it being so loud all the time. Here in Bloomington, it seems much more spotty, or maybe my memory is just kind of not very correct. But for example, in the neighborhood where I live, which happens to be next to the old switchyard, which, to be fair, is filled with coal ash soil, which is probably not very good for cicadas. There are very few, but the biggest single kind of population that I've observed is right here on the grounds of San Shinji. In the front yard here, there's a truly like massive emergence at the base of the maple tree that's right near the Avalokiteshvara shrine. So I find it funny that these Bodhisattvas expounding the Dharma have come up in such great numbers right on our grounds here. Okay, so the 15th chapter of the Lotus Sutra then, and the reason that I was thinking of this is because I've started to try to read through this text. It wouldn't be really an exaggeration to say that the Lotus Sutra is probably the single most important sutra in East Asian Buddhism. And certainly Dogen was very deeply influenced by it. So of course he was a practitioner in the Tendai tradition before he became a Zen practitioner. But he didn't sort of actually throw away everything from his previous experience by any means. We hear a lot that he was sort of rejecting the Tendai tradition, but I think really what he was rejecting was sort of the sort of the degree to which that tradition had kind of become intertwined with government and power and decadence and so forth, and they weren't really, for the most part, kind of practicing the true way as he saw it. But that's not to say that he rejected the philosophical kind of tenets of the Tendai tradition. And the Tendai tradition is centered on the Lotus Sutra. It's considered the highest teaching. And this tradition started with a Chinese monk named Ji, or Chi in Japanese, who lived in the 5th century in China, so pretty early on. And the context in which this happened was, you had all these sutra texts coming into China in sort of a more or less random fashion. And after enough of these things came in, it got to be fairly confusing, because a lot of them were from different traditions and had kind of conflicting messages and seemed contradictory. And so there was a big effort in China to try to systematize all of these sutra texts. And this person, Ji, was one of the kind of, his system basically was one of the most prominent. And the Lotus Sutra, one of the main kind of rhetorical things that it does is say that all of the teachings other than the Lotus Sutra were provisional or expedient means to help teach people who didn't really have the capacity to fully understand the Buddha Dharma. But the Lotus Sutra is the real teaching that he's been wanting to teach all along. And because it did this, and they kind of took it at face value, the Lotus Sutra then is sort of by definition the highest teaching, because that's what it says it is. Everything else is just an expedient means, and this is the true teaching. What's really interesting, though, and there's a famous analogy in the Lotus Sutra about there's the parable of the burning house, which maybe a lot of you already know. But this is a story where there's a house that's on fire, and there are 3 sons inside who are playing, and the father is outside the house and realizes the kids are inside. He can't go in and get them easily, but the kids are distracted playing with their toys, and this is of course a metaphor for samsara, right? We're distracted playing with our toys while the house is on fire. And the Buddha's outside trying to get them out, yelling at them, but they won't come. So he has to use some expedient means, basically, to get them to come out of the house. So he says, oh, those carts that you've always been wanting? I don't know why carts, but well, I've got like 3 of the best imaginable carts out here, so you guys should come out and play with the carts. And so the kids come running out. They're really excited to get these carts. But then it turns out that there's only one cart. And so this is like the teaching of the Lotus Sutra is the one cart. And the three carts are the Shravaka, the vehicle of the Shravaka. So the Shravaka are like disciples of the Buddha, and this sort of represents people who are trying to attain awakening for themselves. And so like the Hinayana that usually is referring to the Shravakayana. The second one is the Pratyeka Buddhas. These are, solitary Buddhas, so people who become awakened themselves and then don't teach, and also don't have a teacher. So this is also sort of part of the Hinayana. And then the Bodhisattvayana, so the Bodhisattva vehicle. So basically the Mahayana is the third cart. But this text says that actually none of those are the real deal. Instead, it's what he calls the Ekayana, the one vehicle. But the really interesting thing about this text is it never explains what the one vehicle is. And the text actually leaves a lot unexplained, which is part of the reason I think that it's been so popular, is because it can be interpreted in so many different ways. But at any rate, that's sort of one of the main things that the text does, at least in the first 10 chapters or so, is sort of say that, actually all of these previous teachings were provisional, but this is kind of the true teaching, but we're not really going to tell you what that teaching is. Okay, so getting back on track here. So to the 15th chapter. So he's already, in the context of what's going on, he's already sort of spoken somewhat extensively about this idea of previous teachings being provisional, and given a bunch of different metaphors for, how this is the case of the parable of the burning house being one. Okay, so in this chapter, it starts out with all of these bodhisattvas that are in the assembly of the Buddha, basically asking if they can preserve this teaching, the teaching of the Lotus Sutra. So it begins here. At that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas who had arrived from other lands and whose numbers exceeded that of the sands of the 8 Ganges rivers. This is always a common thing. So how many sands of the Ganges rivers, or the people are there. So they stood up in the great assembly, bowed with their palms pressed together, and then spoke to the Buddha, saying, "O Bhagavat, if you give us permission to diligently strive to preserve, recite, copy, and pay homage to this Lotus Sutra after the parinirvana of the Buddha in this Saha world, then we will extensively teach it in this land." So they're asking if they can be sort of entrusted to preserve this text. Let's see. So already, okay. So you might notice that this is a little bit strange, right? So they're asking, can we preserve the Lotus Sutra, but we're reading the Lotus Sutra. So where is the position of the Lotus Sutra in this book? And this happens all the time in this text. It's really strange. It's like you're sort of, when you're standing in a room with mirrors in front of you and behind you, and you see this kind of infinite regress. That's sort of the feeling you get reading this text. So in this book that I have that's sort of about it's sort of analysis of the Lotus Sutra, it says, giving some examples of this self-reflexivity of the text. It says, for example, in chapter 1, when the Buddha emits light from his forehead, illuminating 18,000 worlds, the earth shakes and flowers fall from the sky, and Manjushri Bodhisattva interprets these omens to mean that the Buddha will now preach the Lotus Sutra. Again, this is in chapter 1 of the Lotus Sutra, which all Buddhas throughout time and space expound as their final teaching. So he's already heard this in past lives, and it's supposed to be the final teaching of a Buddha, yet it's going to be preached again now within the text of the text that's going to be expounded somehow. So it gives you this really difficult feeling of what's inside and what's outside, which I think is appropriate, right? And this is how it gets interpreted later, is that there's this deep non-separation between what is the text and what isn't the text, what is true reality and what isn't true reality. So then again in so in chapter 11, there's a magnificent jeweled stupa that contains a Buddha whose name is Many Jewels, appropriately. And he emerges from beneath the earth. This is before the Bodhisattvas come out of the earth. And So he made a vow that whenever it may be preached, he will come to bear witness to the truth of the Lotus Sutra, the very sutra in which he himself is now appearing. And he waits, of course, until chapter 11 also to, show up, even though he said, I made a vow to always show up when the Lotus Sutra is being preached. There's this really weird thing going on in this text that's interesting. As scholars have analyzed it, they sort of see it as this literary technique where it's kind of performing or enacting the meaning of the sutra itself. So I said before that it doesn't explain what the one vehicle is, but to these people that interpret it, this kind of rhetorical technique of not having any clear inside or outside to the text is kind of the meaning of the one vehicle itself. That there is this deep non-separation between inside and outside, between self and other, between the insentient and the sentient, and so forth. And also, of course, as Dogen would tell us, between practice and awakening. That's a major part of this as well. And one of this sort of interpretation, you could say, arose from the Lotus Sutra. And it's, even though we ascribe this idea to Dogen, the idea that practice and awakening are one, it has deep roots in the Tendai tradition coming out of the Lotus Sutra. Okay, so the Buddha responds to this request that the Bodhisattvas in attendance be the kind of keepers of the text. And he says, so then the Buddha addressed the assembly of Bodhisattva Mahasattvas, saying, "Enough, O sons of a virtuous family. There is no need for you to preserve the sutra. Why is this? In my Saha world, there are Bodhisattva Mahasattvas equal to the sand of 60,000 Ganges rivers." So remember, there are eight Ganges rivers sands worth of people in the audience now. But he says, I actually have 60,000 Ganges rivers in number, bodhisattvas, blah, blah, blah. And each of these bodhisattvas in turn has a retinue equal to the sands of 60,000 Ganges rivers. So we've got that times 2. After my parinirvana, they can preserve, recite, and extensively teach this sutra. So he's basically saying, I don't need you to do this because I already got plenty of bodhisattvas on the job. Let's see, look at the notes. Okay, so what does this mean kind of metaphorically? So as I was saying before, if everything is, expounding the Dharma, then everything from the earth is like a bodhisattva that is preserving the Buddha's teaching. It doesn't need to be preserved in some special text because what it's ultimately describing is reality itself. And as Uchiyama Roshi would say, the world prior to our minds cooking it, the raw reality, that is what Buddhism is all about. That's what it's getting at. That's what we're doing when we sit zazen. So in this sense, a text is not needed to preserve it. Okay. And furthermore, Dogen expresses this in a number of places by equating sutras with true reality. So he'll, like in, I think I have more on this later, but basically he'll say that, the sutra is reality itself. And that's also sort of what the Lotus Sutra is doing, right? With this weird self-reflexivity. Okay, so, oh yeah, okay, so here's my quotation from Dogen for when he does that. So this is from True Reality of All Beings, Shobogenzo. Hojo-san did a genzo on this a little while back. So this is Dogen now. Shakyamuni Buddha said, "The unsurpassable awakening of all bodhisattvas entirely belongs to this sutra. This sutra opens the gate of expedient means and reveals true and genuine reality." This is actually a quotation from the Lotus Sutra, but this is how he begins the text. So what he does here, gotta switch books. Paragraph 20, blah, blah, blah. Sorry. I bring it, yeah, okay. Okay. Okay, so he says, The unsurpassable awakening of all these Buddhas, whether it was practiced and verified in the past, is practiced, verified in the present, or will be practiced and verified in the future, and whether it is practiced or verified before body or after mind, is in the beginning, middle, and end entirely this sutra. Both that which belongs and that which this belongs to are this sutra. At this very moment, this sutra is verifying all bodhisattvas. This sutra is not sentient. The sutra is not insentient. The sutra is not doing. The sutra is not non-doing. However, when verifying awakening, verifying the person, verifying true reality, and verifying the sutra itself, it opens the gate of expedient means, etc., etc. So he basically is taking this term, this sutra, to be equivalent to the true reality of all beings. So it's not simply a text that we're reading, it's an expression of true reality. And he does this in a number of different places. So this is from True Reality of All Beings, but he also does the same thing in the fascicle called Buddha Sutras or Bukkyo, Mountains and Waters Sutra, Sansui Kyo. He sort of relates the sutra to natural phenomenon. And also reading sutras, Kankin. So he likes to do this a lot. Okay, so back to the Lotus Sutra. Shuffle back through the books again. Okay, so now he's just explained that he doesn't need these people to maintain the sutra for him because he's already got it covered. And so now, when the Buddha said this, all the lands of the great manifold cosmos in the Saha world quaked and the earth split. From out of this crevice, there simultaneously appeared incalculable thousands of myriads of kotis of bodhisattva mahasattvas. All of these bodhisattvas had golden bodies endowed with the 32 marks, that is, the marks that signify that they're Buddhas, and radiating immeasurable, or will become Buddhas, I guess, radiating immeasurable rays of light. They had all previously been living in the space under the earth of the Saha world. And note, this character space can also mean emptiness, and Dogen likes to play with this. Having heard the sound of Shakyamuni's teachings, all of these bodhisattvas emerged from below. So this is where we get the emergence of the bodhisattvas from the ground. Each of these bodhisattvas presided over a great assembly, and each led a retinue equal to the sands of 60,000 Ganges rivers in number. So for each individual bodhisattvas, we have another 60,000 Ganges rivers worth of people following them around. How much more numerous were the bodhisattvas who emerged leading retinues equal in number to the sands of 50,000, 40,000, 30,000, 20,000, or 10,000 Ganges rivers? How much more numerous were the bodhisattvas who emerged leading retinues equal to the sands of just one Ganges river, half a Ganges river, a quarter of a Ganges river, or even just 1,000th of a myriad of a koti, of a nayuta, of the sands of a Ganges river? How many more retinues were there numbering thousands of myriads of kotis of nayutas, etc., 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 even till we're down to the point that they just have one person in their assembly. The number of such bodhisattvas as these is incalculable and limitless beyond all calculation and metaphor, even though they were using a lot of metaphors. So yeah, so there are a lot of them. Now let's see. In Hokke ten Hokke, which is another fascicle of the Shobogenzo, also the Dharma flower turns the Dharma flower. And this term Hokke, the Dharma flower, is actually the abbreviated title of the Lotus Sutra. So the common way that you would refer to the Lotus Sutra in Japanese is Hokke Kyo, the Dharma flower sutra. So you could think of this title as meaning the Lotus Sutra turns the Lotus Sutra also. So let's see here, 271. Get the quotation. So Dogen's commenting on the bodhisattvas emerging from the earth. So the multitudes of the thousandfold world that spring out of the earth have long been great honored saints of the flower of the Dharma. But they spring out of the earth being turned by themselves, and they spring out of the earth being turned by circumstances. In the flower of the Dharma, we should not only realize springing out of the earth. In turning the flower of the Dharma, we should also realize springing out of space. Yeah, we should know that the Buddha's wisdom, with the Buddha's wisdom, not only earth and space, but also springing out of the flower of the Dharma itself. So this is something similar to what he says in Genjo Koan, and he expresses it a little differently in this fascicle. But in Genjo Koan, he says something like, if we, project ourselves onto other dharmas, that's delusion. But when we allow other things to kind of come through us, that is awakening. And here he uses the word turn instead, which is a word that can mean sort of to preach, but also it has the literal meaning of to turn. And so, so they sprang out of the earth being turned by themselves, and they spring out of the earth being turned by others. So here he's saying both of those things are happening at the same time. There's delusion and awakening going on with these bodhisattvas. So we can see the cicadas as the true reality of all beings if we kind of shut up and just observe them as raw reality, or we can cook them in our minds and make up some story about them, think about how many species they represent, think about how many there are per square foot, and then at that point we're not really seeing them as true reality. We're seeing them through our kind of thinking mind. So either of those things can happen. So then in the turning of the Dharma flower, we should not only realize springing out of the earth, in turning the Dharma flower, we should also realize springing out of space. So here, space, again, remember, means emptiness. This character also means emptiness, so it's hard to translate both things at the same time. But so the contrast here is between earth and emptiness. So earth is the relative, emptiness is the absolute, and both of these things are true simultaneously, which he says in the next line. We should know with the Buddha's wisdom, not only earth and space, not only earth and emptiness, but also springing out of the flower of the Dharma itself. So he uses this expression, flower of the Dharma itself, to sort of represent the tying together of the relative and the absolute. So it's not one or the other. It's both of these realities together simultaneously. Okay. Okay, so next, going back to the Lotus Sutra. So Dogen, writes about the stuff in this chapter in many places, so it's sort of hard to fit it all in here, but I'm doing my best. Okay, so next, okay, so next the Bodhisattvas, of which there are many, so they start paying their respects to the Buddha. So actually what happened in the previous chapter is also really interesting. So initially, the Lotus Sutra starts with just Shakyamuni Buddha, talking to his retinue. But after this person, many jewels, shows up, this other Buddha, the Buddha does this thing called recalling his emanations. So as he explains it, basically every other Buddha in the universe is actually an emanation of him. And so because they're all him, he can bring them all back. And all of these emanations of Shakyamuni show up, and there's so many of them that they fill, of course, an incalculable amount of space that is described in great detail. So at any rate, there are many billions of Buddhas, all of which are the emanation of Shakyamuni. So this is one of the reasons that this text was sort of interesting as well, because Mahayana Buddhism had already postulated the idea of many Buddhas in the universe, but I think this text was one of the first to really say that actually all of them are just Shakyamuni Buddha. And furthermore, it's just sort of making this metaphor that because the Dharma is the true reality of all beings, and the Buddha represents the Dharma, the Buddha has thus always been here and always will be here because he's sort of a symbol of true reality. So let's see. All right, so now they're paying respect to all of these many emanations of Buddhas. Where am I? Okay, so having emerged from the earth, each of these bodhisattvas approached the Tathagata's many jewels and Shakyamuni, still seated in the beautiful 7-jeweled stupa in the air. Oh, by the way, they're up floating in the sky also. Going up to them, they bowed until their foreheads touched the feet of both Bhagavats. Then, having bowed to the other Buddhas, each sitting on a lion seat under the jeweled trees, they circumambulated them to the right 3 times, honoring them with their palms pressed together. Having praised them with various bodhisattva eulogies, they withdrew to one side and joyfully gazed at the 2 Bhagavats. All these bodhisattva mahasattvas, having emerged from the earth, praised the Buddhas with various bodhisattva eulogies. When they did, 50 intermediate kalpas passed. So a kalpa, is translated usually as an eon, and it can be described like, there are various ways of describing how long it is. One is, the amount of time it would take that, when you have a bird flying over the Himalayas carrying a piece of silk and just sort of gently, brushing it along the top of the Himalayas and doing that once each year, the number of times that it would take to completely grind down the mountain to nothing. So that would be 1 kalpa. And it took 50 kalpas for these bodhisattvas to pay their respects to all these Buddhas. During that time, the Buddha Shakyamuni sat in silence, and the fourfold assemblies were also silent while the 50 intermediate kalpas passed. So they're doing a lot of zazen. It would seem this makes our sesshin look like very easy. Because of the Buddha's transcendent powers, however, the great assemblies believed that the time that had passed was only half a day. So lucky for them, I guess. Then, through the transcendent powers of the Buddha, the fourfold assemblies also saw the bodhisattvas filling the air throughout immeasurable hundreds of thousands of myriads of kotis of lands. So this, also had me thinking about the cicadas again, because they spend this incredibly long amount of time underground, 17 years, living on a pretty sort of low metabolic rate. They're not moving very much. They're just sort of feeding off the roots of these trees, very similar to sort of a, zazen state. They're just sort of down there doing not very much. And then all of a sudden, after 17 years, just for a couple of weeks, they come up and, do their thing. And it's sort of what was just described in reverse, right? So in the text, these bodhisattvas come up and then they take this really long time to, circumambulate the Buddhas. But in the case of the cicadas, it's sort of the opposite, right? They're underground first and then they come up. So let's see. All right, so Maitreya now. So Maitreya is one of the people in the audience. Maitreya is the Buddha to be, as the tradition says. So he's supposed to be the next Buddha after Shakyamuni. He's confused by all of this. So he's like, I'm going to start just sort of paraphrasing, because I probably don't have enough time to read through this whole thing. But basically he's saying, where did all these bodhisattvas come from? What's the meaning of this? Why is this happening? And the Buddha, says, oh, this is a great question. I'm glad you asked. And because I, never lie, I'll explain it to you. And so what does he say? And, it's kind of funny because, you'd think that if the Buddha was able to create billions of kind of manifestations of himself, he'd be able to do something like conjure up a few bodhisattvas, but nonetheless, Maitreya is confused. So page 218 here. So the Buddha sort of starts to explain, but Maitreya is still confused because he says, when the Tathagata was a prince, he left the palace of the Shakyas, sat on the terrace of enlightenment, which is not far from the city of Gaya, and attained highest complete enlightenment. Since then, more than 40 years have passed. How is it possible, O Bhagavat, for you to have done such great Buddha acts in such a short period of time? So he's only had 40 years, and yet somehow he's managed to teach these billions and billions of bodhisattvas. Is it through the might of the Buddha and through the Buddha's qualities that you have inspired such an assembly of incalculable great bodhisattvas to achieve highest complete enlightenment? And he goes on, and then he is saying, it is, O Bhagavat, difficult to believe such things in this world. So Maitreya is sort of a little doubtful here. And he says it's like this. Suppose a handsome man with dark hair, 25 years of age, were to point to a 100-year-old man and say, he is my son. And the 100-year-old man points to the young fellow and says, he is my father, and he raised me. This would be difficult to believe, and what the Buddha has now taught is exactly like this. So this is Maitreya's metaphor for what's going on here. And Dogen has fun with this same line here. He likes commenting on this, and he comments on it in a couple of places. First, right back in the same, like immediately following the thing that I read before from Hoke Ten Hoke, the Dharma flower turns the Dharma flower. So where does that start? In general, in the time of the flower of the Dharma, inevitably, the father is young and the son old. So that's the quotation from the Lotus Sutra. It is neither that the son is not the son, nor that the father is not the father. We should just learn that the son is old and the father young. Do not imitate the disbelief of this world and be surprised. Even the disbelief of the world is the time of the flower of the Dharma. So what does this mean? So son and father can kind of stand in for relative or absolute because their roles are flipping around here. But basically what he's doing here is similar to what he says in Makahanya Haramitsu, which is where he says, form is emptiness and emptiness is form, but you should also know that form is form and emptiness is emptiness. Which is to say that, if emptiness is already fully within form, you don't really need to say anything about emptiness. You can just say form is form because emptiness is already there. Likewise, you can just say emptiness is emptiness and know that form is already included. So you don't need to make this binary distinction. You can just say the one thing and that already includes the other. So that's sort of similar to what Dogen is doing here with the father and son metaphor. And another thing that's going on here is because true reality is everywhere, it doesn't simply flow from teacher to student or father to son. It flows in all directions, right? Backwards and forwards, from the old son to the young father. And he also says in this passage that even ignorance, that is disbelief of the world, which he says here, is also part of the Dharma flower. So, we don't need to participate in this ignorance, but it is their part of true reality. And there is another quick passage that I'll show you from, this is from The Triple World is Only Mind, another fascicle of the Shobogenzo. So here he says, sometimes a father is young and a child is old. Sometimes a father is old and a child is young. Sometimes a father is old and a child is old. And sometimes a father is young and a child is young. One who imitates the maturity of a father is not being a child, and one who does not pass through the immaturity of childhood will not be a father. We must consider and investigate in detail without fail and without haste the maturity and youth of a child and the maturity and youth of a father. So this is sort of a similar thing where he's playing with these words. And another thing that I think is interesting to think about here, and Hojo-san told me that this was Uchiyama Roshi's sort of interpretation, is that you can think of the father as like awakening, right? So there's kind of the big awakening out there, and we're all kind of the little children participating in it. So in that sense, awakening is the father, and practice is like the son. So we do our zazen to participate in that awakening. But Uchiyama Roshi says it also works the other way, right? That our practice is like the father, and it kind of produces this world of awakening, the son, that we then participate in. So all of these things are, again, getting at this perfect interpenetration between absolute and relative. All right, so how am I doing on time? Okay, so I'm about done here. At the end of this chapter, it doesn't actually answer the question. So the question about, how did you teach all of these bodhisattvas if you've only been awakened for 40 years, doesn't get answered until the next chapter, which is called the lifespan of the Tathagata and is considered the most important chapter usually in the Lotus Sutra. And basically what he does in the next chapter is say that, what I sort of already alluded to is that he's always been in the world. He's been alive for, of course, millions of billions of myriads of kotis of eons. And he's been teaching bodhisattvas for that whole time. And he also explains in that chapter that he never actually died. The parinirvana was just a performance that he put on for the sake of awakening people, because he felt that if he left the world, that would inspire them to practice somehow. So at any rate, that's what happens in the next chapter. But I think I will leave it at that there. I think that if you take anything away from all this strange stuff, is that when we look out into the world, whether it's something we like or something that we dislike, true reality is always being expressed right there. And it's through our practice that we can participate in that more readily. But even if we're not participating in it, it's still there. So with that, I'll stop. And if anyone has any questions, please go ahead. Stunned into silence.
If it's all right, I could just comment.
Please.
I mean, I like the pairing of the cicadas and the bodhisattvas in the way that they can teach us impermanence in kind of two ways, where they won't be here forever. So if we're annoyed by their singing or by them crowding the sidewalks, it can help us learn to just wait for them to pass. And at the same time, I was actually walking yesterday from the grocery store, and I'm in downtown Bloomington, only about 2 blocks from the square. So they're not as populous here, but where there are trees, they're definitely around. And what I noticed yesterday was many of those that had turned up are now smushed or dead in some way. And then again, we have that idea of impermanence there. So if you think about it in terms of like reincarnation sense, we could think about the cicadas being, reincarnated bodhisattvas for us.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, what you said about, being on the sidewalk and having to sort of wait for them to pass, that sort of, I think that idea has come up for me too. It's sort of a mindful practice to not step on them, because there's so many of them everywhere. You really have to sort of pay attention to what you're doing to kind of respect, these creatures that have come out in such huge numbers all of a sudden. So yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks for your comment. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, anything? Mark, did you have something?
Yeah, kind of.
Go ahead.
When you talk about the reality right in front of us, the raw reality, one of the ways I've always looked at it is accepting what's in front of you. You can call it opening a hand of thought. You can say yes, or just saying yes, but it is just pure and simple, not living by the idea of what you want in reality, but living by the reality itself, right? So we just kind of twisted Dogen a little bit there. And I had like a very long, I did one of my long drives yesterday, which was really, really nice. I had 400-mile round trip, went to go see a friend, haven't seen in several years. And one of my favorite hobbies and things that I like and enjoy is pictures from outer space. Seriously. Especially of the International Space Station looking down on the Earth. They're just gorgeous, wonderful, beautiful. You always think, boy, it would be really, really great to be up there looking down just to see, the beautiful Earth that we are. And as I was driving on 74, it was like, I realized that doesn't really matter. I see that right now, right here, right in front of me. The beauty of the world, that the idea that I want to see is not really, doesn't have to be that idea. That idea is pure, simple there. it's there stuck in traffic. It's there behind a semi. It's there when, oh no, I better slow down because there's a cop. Yeah, it's the raw reality, and the joy of it all is there so immensely. And so, yeah, that's my comment.
Yeah, thank you. I think that it bears sort of pointing out, as we do often with this, that kind of acceptance is not condoning, of course. So even though true reality is always there, and it behooves us as practitioners to accept it as such, that is our practice, that doesn't mean that we're condoning it. So even if it's the case that true reality is some really awful thing that's happening, and on some sense, it's of course most unnatural to accept it in moments like that, right? Like our minds tend to jump in those kind of situations and start saying things, that aren't just simply like taking in the scene in front of us. And I think that that's healthy, right? Like we're evaluating the situation and realizing that whatever is going on probably is not really in accord with the world of awakening as we would like to see it. And so there's room for action to be done there, of course. It's not simply that we need to accept everything and not do anything. It's that we need to accept and then also act when action is necessary to help bring kind of reality into accord with the world of awakening. It sounds contradictory, right? Like that, if the whole world is the world of awakening, how can we be working to bring it into accord with that? But I think that through our Zazen practice, where we realize this radical sense of interconnection, there are things that we can do in concrete conventional reality that help to make the world better reflect that. That's what Buddhists talk about in the past, about trying to make this world a pure land, and so forth. It's not that true reality isn't already here, but we can sort of make it accord with it even better, or make it easier for beings to sort of realize that truth, I guess, is maybe a better way to say it.
And on that note, yes, I did observe the speed limit. I was a considerate driver, and I made that effort to stop for the deer so that they can pass.
That's good, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you hear things like in Japanese Buddhism, like samurai using like Zen philosophy to, cut down their enemies in emptiness. And, in a sense, like if all you're thinking about is absolute reality, it's like, yeah, okay, I guess that's true. But at the same time, that's a complete abrogation of all the responsibilities of a bodhisattva and what we're trying to do. We can't help other beings, realize true reality if we're hacking them to bits. So, I think that sort of teaching is very misguided. Hoko, go ahead.
I'm wondering, because one of your many identities is as a scientist, as a biologist, when you think about things like the cicadas and the bodhisattvas coming from the earth, I wonder how your practice of biology or plant studies informs your practice of Zen. There are lots of folks who appreciate practice, appreciate Zen, because it seems to take quite a scientific approach to the world. There are people on both sides of that. But as somebody who spent an awful lot of time with science, I just wonder how that influences how you see your practice and what lessons you take from that.
So for me, my background, is in sort of more natural history type stuff. So looking at diversity in the biological world. So, this involves, it's bound up with classification, of course, which is like very deeply in kind of relative territory, not like absolute territory at all. It's making fine-grained distinctions between everything and, being able to separate this from that. So in that sense, it's very, deeply worldly, right? But on the other hand, I think that through recognizing all of those distinctions, you get this magnificent picture of a much broader whole that I think, most people have a difficult time appreciating. Like for example, just with the cicadas, there are actually 3 different species, in Brood 10. And being a nerd, I've been, going around and trying to find. I did find all 3. One's kind of rare, so I was happy to find that. But I think though that this gives you this picture of just how sort of complex and interconnected everything is, because there's so many different species in the world. In the plant kingdom, there are hundreds of thousands of species, and yet most people can only recognize like 3 different kinds of plant. So I think knowing the details of the relative gives you an appreciation of the absolute, and I think that that's again what our practice is all about, right? Is fusing these 2 things together. So I'd say for me, being able to see diversity, see the individual, it informs what it really means in sort of the big picture sense.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting.
Anything else this morning? Yeah, Sawyer.
Yeah, I was at on the Sanshin grounds a few days ago, just doing some weeding among the flowers, and also inevitably noticed the presence of cicadas there in a way that I haven't noticed anywhere else during this time. Right under that silver maple tree and the box elder, both just like deafening presence of cicadas, and all of their carapaces, I think is the scientific word, all of their shells, and then all of them flapping around and all over the picnic tables, and I was just there weeding with this chorus of cicadas, and that that thought appeared, the Dharma is being preached right now. And I didn't know quite what to do with that thought. It was like it sort of remained as a thought in my mind, but as I just sort of settled into plucking weeds along the sidewalk and in the presence of this preaching, I think what I most felt was just that I felt like I wasn't alone. I felt like it was like there was company. And so I'm wondering, I guess, about the idea that when living beings hear insentient beings preaching the Dharma, they cease to be living beings. But I very much felt sort of like a living being hearing these other creatures, feeling myself as a sort of a creature among creatures, in the company of creatures. So I wonder what that distinction of non-living and living being, or Buddha and living being, and cicadas.
Yeah. First, just to reiterate like how loud they are here at Sanshinchi. I came over a couple of days ago, and Yuko was outside, and I was having a conversation with her, and we were 6 feet apart or so, and I was literally having to like yell at her to talk because these things were so loud. And they do this cool, like chorusing behavior. So they each have an individual call, but then in these sort of waves, they'll they'll do this chorusing where they synchronize their calls, and it's just this incredible, like, sort of, power that sort of washes over you. So to speak to, feeling like a creature among creatures, I don't think that is contradicting really what is being said in that koan by needing to be insentient to really hear the Dharma, because it's not meaning that we need to somehow change our nature, or like cease living really. It's sort of playing with the meaning of mujo, or insentient. So like the character Jo means something like emotions, or like sentiment. So we can still be living creatures without letting our kind of emotions and sentiments get in the way of the thing that we're experiencing. And even if we do like have that feeling, of like, oh, I feel kind of at one with these other beings, that's sort of like a commentary, I think, on the thing that you actually experienced directly, which was this, expounding of the Dharma. So the two are always there together, right? And it's not that one is outside the way and one is inside the way, but rather that they work together to, create the sort of scenery of true reality, or the scenery of, zazen, as Uchiyama Roshi would say. So yeah, I think that they're compatible. It also reminded me of, one of the first times that I did a Sanshinji style sesshin was with Shoryu, my Dharma brother, who some of you know, at his place out it's like in the middle of nowhere in Arkansas in the Ozarks. And, it was my first time, and I was like really having a hard time because, it's so long. And there's this stream that kind of runs by outside of the zendo, and as kind of the afternoon turned to evening, all of these spring peepers started calling, and I sort of felt like they were kind of supporting me somehow, in my practice, like encouraging me to keep going. But really, I think, the reason that it felt like that was because, I could kind of hear that expounding of the Dharma, and then, what I was telling myself in my mind was kind of a commentary on it, not the thing itself, So, anyways, yeah, I appreciate your experience. It's familiar to me. Anything else this morning? Dan, is that Dan?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for allowing an immeasurably curious sort of outlier to your sangha. Everyone, thank you. And I just briefly, I just want to add to this wonderful idea of the natural world interpenetrating the sort of absolute spiritual conscious aspect of human beings that are, I dare say, maybe, well, more sentient, sometimes to a fault, but as human beings. So that aside, the heaviness aside, this would be very light. Our abode in sort of limited fissures northways is has not been hit by the cicadas yet. Yet, of course, and I'm grateful that you elaborated to creatures, to all creatures, and no cicadas yet. I'm sure they'll booming very soon. It's been a cold snap and rainy, but we live by a small lake, and there's many waterfowl there, And just this sense of interest, always a light in me. I'm always observing them. And there's a wonderful gaggle swarm of ducklings, tiny ducklings, 17, and remaining steady, 17 little ducklings, only with the mother. One mother, a single mother. And occasionally a the colorful one will sort of pop in, but it's mostly just the mother worrying constantly, and speaking to these children. So, and the swarm is very interesting. It's a swarm of them. So that's, anyway, I just wanted to lend out that little story, and that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that also reminded me of, there's another chapter of the Shobogenzo called the Sound of Valley Streams and the Color of Mountains. And this is a commentary on a Buddhist poem that says, the sound of valley streams is the Buddha's long, broad tongue. So one of these 32 marks that I mentioned is, the Buddha is supposed to have an unusually long and broad tongue. And the color of mountains is the kind of Buddha's body, basically, is the gist of the poem. And, this is the same idea, of course, right, is that these natural phenomena are teaching us about the Dharma, or expressing the Dharma. So I think really any time that we see anything, and it doesn't even have to be natural, Dogen will say also that the sounds of the marketplace are also expressing the Dharma. I think it can be a little harder to see there maybe, but nonetheless, it's there as well. So yeah, Dogen is a great proponent of this idea that everything is always expressing the Dharma to us. Anything else this morning? Oh yeah, Dan, go ahead.
And sorry, it's scholarly, but in a textual kind of a way. So I find similarities. I have not gone far into the Flower Ornament Sutra, but I find many similarities with what your talk has touched upon. For starters, just really the only thing is the single vehicle. That is the gist of this voluminous sutra. It's very long and flowery, and jewels and flowers, jewels, and all sorts of, So I was wondering if, and this was a much later sutra, but it's also very Chinese, very generally speaking. I just wondered if anyone might know of the sort of birthing of that sutra, how it might be connected to the Lotus Sutra, and this, I don't know very much about it. I've read just maybe 100 pages is all, but anyway, thank you.
Yeah,
and I don't necessarily have to have an answer.
So the Flower Ornament Sutra is, it's actually also Indian, and has a similar vintage to the Lotus Sutra. It's about from the same time period, as far as people can work out. It has kind of an interesting history. So I think it's the first chapter and the last chapter circulated independently as their own sutra texts, and then at some later point, all the intervening chapters were filled in. But the final chapter, the Ganda Vyuha, is itself very long. It's like 600 pages long or something, and does a lot of the same stuff. It's very long. I gave a talk about part of it, I don't know, like a year ago, and read from just the very beginning of the last chapter where they name all of the bodhisattvas in the assembly, and it's like, like 5 pages of just names of people. So it's kind of like the Lotus Sutra, like on crack, in Zhiyi's system of categorizing the sutras, what he said, it was kind of interesting, was that the Avatamsaka, the Flower Ornament Sutra, according to him, was the first teaching that the Buddha gave, and what he was trying to sort of teach in that was similar to what he wants to teach in the Lotus Sutra, but he hadn't sort of broken people in enough yet, so it was just completely incomprehensible. And then he switched to the sort of like Hinayana style until people were sort of like up to the level to hear the Lotus Sutra later. That's the way that Zhi interpreted it. That's of course like completely ahistorical, but that's the way that it was interpreted in China. But as to the sort of relationship between like the authors of the Lotus Sutra and the Flower Ornament Sutra, we really don't have much information on that stuff. The kind of archaeological evidence, the early manuscripts are very few and far between in the Indian tradition. We know that the Lotus Sutra was first translated into Chinese around the 3rd century. So it was very early, and there's a lot of textual evidence to suggest that the Flower Ornament Sutra is, of a similar age. It might have been translated into Chinese a little bit later, but at any rate, we know that they're both pretty early Mahayana texts. So I hope that helps a little bit. All right. Anything else? Oh, Ado. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to share a couple experiences. One is in relationship to what you said about when we listen to the birds sing, and then, when we listen to human noises, we perceive one as positive and one as negative, especially in the zendo. Once there was something going on at Hokioji, and country center here, and it was a sesshin. A sesshin was going on, and someone was going to be moving in during that time, and someone expressed concern about how this might distract the practitioners to have someone moving in. Anyway, my response was, well, one, this person will be sensitive about that, but the other thing is, just to raise the question of this is part of our reality. This person moving in is not any different than the birds singing or the cow mooing or the lawnmower going, so why do we need to make that distinction that this is, sort of positive, listening to birds sing, but hearing somebody moving something is a negative. It's all just part of our reality, whether it's buses going by or cars going by. We don't really need to make that distinction, I don't think. But anyway, the other thing is about when you were talking about because of your biology background, you probably make more distinctions between things than many of us do who might just look out and see a bunch of pretty flowers and different colors of green. And I notice, especially if I'm in a big place like a park with trails or something, it's very beautiful, but it's like a scene. It's not like I'm picking out individual things. I could, if I stopped, and even though I don't know the names of them, I could see that there's a difference between this and that, but I'm basically just seeing this big picture. Whereas in my own yard, which is a much smaller environment, I'm actually more likely to see the distinction. There's a lot of diversity just in someone's yard. There's bees and birds and flowers and grass. And when I'm in a smaller environment like this, I'm actually more likely to notice those details. And so You know, sometimes people feel like they need to get away to get out to the country where there aren't human noises and there's more diversity. And I understand that, but there also is the universe is just right here in my yard. So there's that reality too. I just wanted to share those thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that echoes what Mark, was saying, that, we have this view from outer space, that looks really peaceful and beautiful and calm. Or, you might have a view in a national park looking over a mountain or something. Whereas, if you're at home, maybe you have this kind of more fine-grained, nitty-gritty. But you can also, step back there and just sort of see the beauty of what's in front of you, even if it is something that you normally focus on as being, very particular. So yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. All right, well, I think we should probably wrap up. So thank you, everyone.